Hi, here is Markku Wilenius, and I want to talk to you about how to use scenario method. The scenario method is a method whereby you understand and realize and see different options about the future. And we should use it whenever we have particularly big uncertainty in our lives or in the world that we are observing. Now, let's take a very concrete example. Early in the year, very few of us were thinking that actually Putin will push his army over the Russian borders to the Ukraine and start a war. It is very unlikely for all of us to think that this is a real possibility, although some of us were fearful about it, but we didn't really want to think about it because that was an unpleasant thing to think about, and we didn't think that Putin is that crazy guy that will do that. No. Of course we know he's a bit crazy guy, but you know, not that crazy. And in fact, I have a very good Ukrainian friend, and I was having this discussion with him just a week before the Russians started the war. And I said to this guy that, what do you think? How do you feel about this situation? And then we were sort of chit-chatting there, and then we sort of both agree that, he's a crazy guy and he's put all these troops on the border, but he cannot be that crazy. Then we moved forward a couple of days more. I think it was 3 days before the actual invasion. And then I started to sense, no, there is something more to this. And I messaged to my friend. At that time, he and his family was actually by happenstance in Poland, skiing. And I reached him, I said to him, "Oh, you are in Poland." "Yeah, we are here in skiing." "Don't go back to Ukraine. Things are gonna get really tough there. Come to Finland instead." The next day, they started to move towards Finland, and that was the day when the war actually began. Now, in the discussions, and I'm particularly referring to some of the discussions we had in Finland, since we have a very close relationship with Russia, we have over 1,000 kilometers of border, and there have been, over the years, decades and centuries, a lot of conflicts in between us. There was a lot of discussion about that, what is going to happen with all of that. And again, in all these public debates, most of the people were actually thinking that, if not all people were thinking that, well, okay, it's an aggression, but nothing really will come out of that. But actually, I just learned very recently, there was one guy who came out and said very loud that, and this was a couple of months before this whole thing started, maybe 1.5 months, that actually what is going to happen is that something really nasty will come out and Finland is gonna be applying for NATO membership. Now, until that time we still thought in Finland, people thought and the politicians thought that no, not NATO. We want to stay independent. We don't need NATO for anything, and we are very happy what we were. So when this guy came up with this type of a message, he was kind of largely neglected, and very few actually believed his words. He, however, in his own organization, which is a think tank, they had done a little bit before that, which is the end of 2021, they have done several scenarios about what might happen, and they have thought about, as in a rigorous scenario work, you do a kind of a range of different possible outcomes. Some of them, yes, the Russian will sort of cool off, and the troops will be called away from the border, and And as a result of all the diplomatic efforts, things gonna kind of cool down. But then there was also this kind of a scenario that yes, this will in the next phase start as a war. Russia will invade Ukraine. There's gonna be a lot of fighting. This gonna spread as a impact to the other countries that would change the positions of the countries, including Finland and so forth. So this organization was making these scenarios, and one of these scenarios were something like the worst case scenario, which is that actually the Russia will invade Ukraine, things start to escalate, other countries get affected, and all first, second and tertiary implication of this event. Now, with that, they started to look which of the scenarios will then actually be most likely to materialize. And as we know now, by the early of this year, things started to heat up. Slowly but surely, it was like a kind of bringing the more heat into the kettle where the frog was. And frog was still uncomfortable in that kettle, as the frogs are, but the heat was definitely there, and it was coming more kind of a likely that maybe something will happen. But when this person, his name is Risto Pentila, when he actually said that out and loud in the end of the January, that this is really what might happen, that Finland will be pushed to make the decision to join the NATO or not, then that message at that time was something that very few actually believed that this will happen. So very sort of an unlikely scenario from their perspective. However, from this guy's perspective, out of doing all these other scenarios, it became much more likely that this is exactly what's going to happen, and this is how it's going to change the current situation. That's exactly the type of the use of the scenario method we need to be using, particularly if the times are certain, if there is a lot of complexities. In other words, if there is a lot of possible outcomes. It doesn't work very well when things are very stable and nothing is actually changing in the environment and in the conditions. But it's very, very useful method in the times when we are seeing something different coming that changes and breaks the patterns and brings about something totally new in our lives, or in the life, in this case, of the Europe in particular. This type of the thing, how we are actually using that scenarios and how we actually build our decision based on those scenarios, how we open up our mind into the world, particularly those ones that we sometimes don't like to see because they are not very pleasant. We don't think that they are something that we want to experience in the future. But just because of that, we need to explore them as well. Since we don't know the future, and whatever we know about the past might or might not lead into the future. So obviously in this case, you could also trace back and say, hey, wow, there was already 20-something years of Putin's regime, and ever since he started to hold the power, he has been systematically kind of building up this type of the model behavior where he goes into kind of over and beyond his own regime and start wars, is involved with the wars, use very brutal methods. So that was all kind of traceable. But still, this thing what he did with Ukraine, very few believed, even if there were all these traces, because obviously this was done in an euphoria that, well, I have tried this trick a couple of times, it works, so I continue, and I'm just now fishing in the bigger pond, so to say. For us, the key learning of this is the following. When we are thinking about how the world changes, look for possible disruptions and build your scenarios around how those disruptions might affect to the future. You can still think that one of the future is that it comes about pretty much as it has done in the past, so that there is kind of a continuation. But in uncertain times and with a lot of complexity, this is exactly the unlikely scenario. And more likely scenario is that one where things changes, something new happens, and there is a kind of that type of interaction within the system, that something totally different comes out of that. This is the way that we can use systematically the futurist tools, and thus open up the future, make ourselves much more intelligent how we actually deal with the future, and be much quicker to respond whatever comes. Where are you talking about your organization or your own futures? Use these scenario methods. Build 3 to 4 to 5 different scenarios. Think about what type of implication each of those scenarios have. What do they take? What are the type of the driving forces that are affecting each of those scenarios? And out of that analysis, pick your choice. What is the scenario you believe in? And then start to prepare for that scenario.